Hi everybody, I'm Miss Beth and I'd like to welcome you back to the High Gas Fee Studio. As you know, High Gas Fee stands for Have I Got a Story for You? And today, as usual, have I got a story for you. It's about a little girl who was born 130 years ago. She was born in the city of Green Cove Springs, Florida, and they named her Augusta. Now, her family was rather poor, but Augusta didn't care. She had 6 older brothers and sisters that kept her very busy, and there were 7 more children that were born after she was born. 14 kids. That was a lot of mouths to feed. Well, when Augusta was about 5 years old, she went to play in her backyard, and she noticed after a heavy rainfall that there was a mud puddle. So, being a 5-year-old, she went and stepped right in the mud puddle and started marching around and having a great time playing in the mud. She reached down in that mud and grabbed handfuls of it, expecting it to seep through her fingers and roll down her arms. But as she held that mud, she realized that it wasn't really seeping through her fingers like she thought. She began to squish it and hold it tight, and she realized that it would form into shapes. She played in that mud pit day after day, and as she got better at making different shapes with that mud, which was really red clay, she learned that she could put shapes together to make little figurines. And her favorite little figurines to make were of farm animals, ducks and chickens and cows and pigs with curly tails. She had so much fun playing in the clay pit every day. Her father was a minister. He was very strict. And when he would see the little figurines that Augusta made, he would get very angry. He called them graven images, and he said it went against what the Bible taught. So Augusta sometimes would get spankings because she had made these little sculptures. Sometimes he would even go and stomp on them and destroy the sculptures. How do you think that made Augusta feel? And as much discipline as she received because of making these little statues, she just couldn't help herself. She loved playing in the clay pit. She just couldn't stay away from it. When Augusta was 13, her family moved to the southern part of Florida. It was West Palm Beach. But when she went into the backyard of their new house, she saw that the dirt was very different. There was no clay in the soil. What was she going to do if she couldn't play in the clay pit, if she couldn't make her little statues? Oh, it was heartbreaking. One day, Augusta was riding in the back of a horse-drawn wagon that her principal was driving. There were several kids in the back, and he was taking them home from school. As she went through town, she noticed a store that said pottery. Pottery? Pottery's made out of clay. She asked the principal to stop, and she jumped out of the back of the wagon and ran into the shop. She talked to the shop owner. She said, "How do you make your pottery?" And he said, "With clay." She said, "Where do you get your clay?" He said, "Oh, we don't have any down here. I have to have it shipped in. Let me show you." And he walked her to the back of the store. And back there were bucket after bucket after bucket of clay. She thought, oh, if only she could have just a little bit of clay. The owner said, "I'll do you one even better. Here, take 3 buckets of this home with you and have a good time." She could not believe her good luck. She gathered up those 3 buckets and she went running back outside. When the principal got her home, she jumped out of the back of the wagon. She grabbed the 3 buckets and she went running in. She felt like she needed to hide the clay so that her dad wouldn't see it. And so she put it in an old trunk that belonged to her mom and didn't tell him about it. A few days later, when she was at school, the principal asked her, "How's that clay working? Have you made any little sculptures?" "Oh, yes, I have. I've had so much fun doing it." And he said, "Why don't you bring some in? I'd love to see it." So the next day, she gently wrapped up some of her little figurines and she took them to school. Well, when the principal saw him, he saw that she was really talented at sculpting clay. And so he made her an offer. He said, I will pay you $1 a week if you will come to school and teach the other children how to sculpt. She could not believe her ears. She was so excited. She ran all the way home. She couldn't wait to tell her parents. When she told her mom was excited, but she was a little hesitant to tell her dad. She wasn't sure what he was going to say. At first, he didn't like the idea too much. But then the thought of having an extra $1 each week to go to help look after all those children and put food on the table was quite appealing. And so he agreed to let her do it. She would do this once a week, teaching the kids, even though they were her same age, how to sculpt. The principal knew that the county fair was soon coming, and so he encouraged her to make some extra special figurines and maybe enter them in the art competition for the state fair. And that is what Augusta did. She made some little figurines and she put it in the exhibit at the fair. And lo and behold, she won first place. She got a ribbon that talked about how creative she was, and she won $25. Oh, she was so excited. And that day she realized that she wanted to be an artist for the rest of her life. Now, there was a school up in New York. It was called the Cooper Union School of Art. It was something that Augusta was very interested in. You see, you didn't have to pay tuition, you didn't have to pay money to go to this art school, but you had to have a letter of reference. You had to have somebody of importance say that you were really good at what you did. And so the county fair director said he would write her such a letter. With her savings and her winnings, she got on a train and she headed up to New York City. When she stepped off the train, she had $4.60 left in her pocket, but she went directly to the school. She met Mrs. Reynolds, who was the admissions counselor there, and she said, "My name is Augusta Savage, and I would like to go to art school here." Well, Ms. Reynolds said, "First, you need a letter of recommendation." She said, "I've got one," and she presented Mrs. Reynolds the letter. Mrs. Reynolds read it, and she said, "Okay, this looks good. So let me see some of your work." Augusta just sat there. She hadn't brought any of her figurines. She said, "I left everything that I've done back in Florida." Mrs. Reynolds said, "There's no way I can let you in this program without seeing some of the pieces that you've made. But I'll tell you what, get you some clay. I'll give you 24 hours. Come up with something and bring it back in tomorrow." Augusta headed out of the office and she immediately went, and with some of the money she had left over, she bought a block of clay and headed back to her hotel. She began to sculpt a little duckling. That is what had won at the county fair. But as she looked at it, she realized she was really going to have to step up her game. She was going to have to impress Mrs. Reynolds. And so she crushed that little duckling down and she started all over again. She decided that she was going to create a bust. A bust is the head and shoulders of a person. She worked all night working on the head, the face, the hair, the shoulders. In the morning, she had finally finished. She was exhausted, but she carefully wrapped the bust in a wet cloth, gently picked it up, and headed over to the Cooper Union School of Art. She walked into Miss Reynolds' office and set it down and gently unwrapped the sculpture. Miss Reynolds walked over and looked at it. She looked at the front, she looked at the back, she looked at the top, and she said, "Augusta, you need to write a letter to your parents and say that you are now officially in the Cooper Union School of Art." Yahoo! She was so excited, I bet she skipped all the way back to her hotel. Well, Augusta had to find a place to live so that she could start school. And she found an apartment in the town in New York City, but it's in a district or a section of New York City called Harlem. Now, something that I have not told you yet about Augusta Savage was that she was African American. And this was all going on in the 1920s. That was a very difficult time for women, and it was even more difficult if you were African American. She had a lot of trials, a lot of struggles, but she knew that she could conquer it. And she picked Harlem at the perfect time. Something was going on in Harlem. It was almost like, an explosion of art. And it wasn't just visual arts like paintings and sculptures. It was music. It was dance. It was writing. It was poetry. It was all of it. The people who lived in Harlem were predominantly African American. And it was a time that they got to express themselves, the good parts of their life, the difficult parts of their life, through their creativity and through the arts. And Augusta Savage was at the perfect place at the perfect time. She continued to go to school, and her skill level got even better. She was doing a lot more figurines, sculptures, and those busts. And she was becoming quite well known as a sculptor in her community. She saved every penny and did the best that she could. In fact, I would love to show you some of the sculptures that she did during this time. Take a look at this one. This one is called Portrait of John Henry. Look at how she did his hair with clay. It's just squished on, but it really defines his hairline and the texture of his hair. And here is a bust that she did of a friend of hers. It was another artist by the name of Gwendolyn Knight. And sometimes she did figurines not of any particular person, but just of some actions, like the flute player and the dancer. And she even did one called Portrait of a Baby. I would say, though, her most famous piece was this one. It was called Gamin. Gamin in French means street urchin or street boy. And that is what this bust, this sculpture looks like. It's a young man. His shirt is wrinkled and his hat is sitting askew on his head. He is just a street boy. But if you look closer, look at his face. She was able to give him an expression, give him a look. And it was a look that he was actually wiser than his years. He had probably seen a lot, heard a lot, and felt a lot being on the street and having to survive. Well, with the sculpture of Gamin, it really launched her career in Harlem. And she won a scholarship because of that sculpture to go to Paris. She took her savings and the scholarship money, and she was able to go do her own trip. Once she got there, she learned so much. She did a lot of exhibits. She did a lot of study. She did a lot of travel. And she even submitted some of her pieces to the Salon, which was an art show that was very famous. And she won quite a few prizes. She stayed over in Europe for about 2 years learning. And then she decided it was time to come home. She arrived back in New York, but something bad had happened in the United States. It was called the Great Depression. People who had invested their money in the stock market suddenly lost their money, which means the banks lost money, which means people couldn't get their money, which means they didn't have any money to buy food or clothing. And it was a very awful time in the United States. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people couldn't afford food. And it was very, very difficult. For people living in Harlem that were African Americans who were already having a difficult time, it was a terrible time for them. No one was purchasing art. They were having a hard enough time finding food to buy or money to buy food. She really struggled during this time, but she knew that she wanted to make a difference. She wanted to keep up the fight for African American artists, for women artists. And so she decided, if I can't sell very many of my pieces of artwork, I'm still going to help out. I am going to open a school for children to come. If they can pay me, that's great. But if they can't afford to come, they can come anyway. They can use the few supplies that I have because I want to instill in them creativity and a sense of worth and let them be able to express themselves and how they're feeling. She became very well known in her community for helping out the children. And as you can imagine, in a rough time, the children loved coming to her school. And Augusta loved teaching the children. Towards the end of the 1930s, there was a fair coming to New York. It was the New York World's Fair. And because of her work with the children in the school that she had started and the sculpture of Gammon and the others, she was asked to make a sculpture for the New York World's Fair. Oh, she thought about it for a while. She needed to do something big. She needed to do something impressive. She needed to do something that made a statement that showed that people of color were creative and talented and equal. She came up with this. It's this one. It's called the Harp. She featured 12 African American children standing in a row, all singing. But the way that she designed their robes made their robes look like the strings of a harp. And the soundboard, the piece that the strings are attached to, was the hand of God. And she did this to show that the children's voices were an instrument in God's hand. Now, this sculpture was very, very big. I've got some photographs of her working on it. Look at her as she's working on it, how big those figures are. Now, this piece was 16 feet tall. People came from all over the world to see it, and millions of people saw it, and it was the most photographed art piece of the fair. Well, when the fair was over, there was no place to store the harp. It was way too tall. She couldn't get it in her apartment. And so, as the bulldozers came to rake away all the debris of the fair, they wound up knocking over the harp and crushing it down and hauling it away. Kind of disappointing, isn't it? Of course, you'll see little small replicas out there since she did so well, but unfortunately, that piece of artwork no longer exists. In fact, not very many pieces of her artwork exist today. You see, she didn't have a lot of money. A lot of people, when they sculpt something, they will then have it made into a bronze or a metal statue. It's very expensive. Augusta didn't have that kind of money. And so most of her statues were either made in clay or out of plaster, which is like a very, very smooth concrete, but it can be real chalky and easy to break. So as the years, as the decades have gone by, her artwork has disappeared, probably from getting broken. I do have an interesting story. I was researching the Gammon sculpture. Back in 2002, a lady had a friend, an elderly friend, and the elderly friend was about to die. And she told the lady, "You've been my friend for a long time. I'm about to die. If there's anything in my house that you want, you're welcome to have it." The friend was sad, but she walked through the house and she saw this little statue of a boy who looked very wise, and she said, very cute. She asked her elderly friend if she could have that statue, and her friend said no problem. She took it home and displayed it in her house. Several years passed, and a show called the Antique Roadshow was coming through her community. She thought that the statue was quite old, and she was wondering if it was worth anything. So she took it to the Antique Roadshow. She presented it to the curator. The curator looked at it. He saw that on the back of it, it said Savage. and on the front it said Gammon. Could it be? He turned it upside down, and he could tell that it wasn't made out of metal. It was made out of plaster. What she would do is make her sculptures out of plaster, which is white, and then she would paint them to look like they were bronze. The lady indeed had that sculpture of Gammon. And the curator told her, "Ma'am, you've got something that is very valuable. Right now, today, it would be worth $20,000, but possibly even more." The lady couldn't believe it. You can go on Google and look up Antique Roadshow Gammon, and you can see when he told her all about it and see the actual sculpture that Augusta Savage did. Fortunately, it's not still sitting in that lady's house. It is now the property of the Smithsonian. And if you ever head up to that area, Washington, D.C. area, you can go and see Augusta Savage's sculpture of Gammon. Well, after the fair, Augusta was getting a little tired. It had been a long run. She had worked very hard and decided that she was going to take a break. And so she moved up into the mountains of New York. There she opened up a little small school where she helped teach children about art. And she worked at a mushroom farm. People kind of lost touch with her. And she died not much longer after that. You don't hear much about Augusta Savage until the last few decades, when a few of her pieces have come to surface. And it was the people that she invested her life in that has kept her memory alive. Remember me talking to you about how she taught different students? Well, some of those students that she taught for free, became famous artists thanks to her. Artists such as Jacob Lawrence and Norman Lewis and Charles Alston. They all attribute much of their success to the time and energy that she put into teaching children. Before she died, she said this. She said, "I have created nothing really beautiful, really lasting. But if I can inspire one of these youngsters to develop the talent I know they possess, then my monument will be in their work." And that is exactly what Miss Augusta Savage did. Invested herself, and through their work, her memory is kept alive.